Right, hello Year 11, and this is the pre-exam talk for Crime and Punishment. This is an exam which is worth 1 hour 15 minutes, and this just goes through the different information that you have to cover on the exam. The exam is divided up into two sections, so there's a section A on Whitechapel, question 1, 2A and 2B, no choices on that one. And then question B is about crime and punishment from around about the year 1000 to the present day. You have to answer questions 3 and 4, then you get a choice of questions and you do either question 5 or 6. So let's get on with the advice for the exam. So here you'll find an overview of the different questions in the exam. It tells you how much marks each question is worth. Remember, you should spend around 1.5 minutes per mark. So 4-mark questions, 6 minutes, and so on. You have to be quite careful with your timing. And there's a little bit of exam advice. So if you want to, you can pause here and just read the overview of the different questions. So let's get on and look at section A, which is all about Whitechapel. And this is all about Whitechapel in the 19th century, the work that we did on things like Jack the Ripper, for example. So question 1 on Whitechapel is a describe 2 features question. It's out of 4, so you spend about 6 minutes on this. So you might get a question such as describe 2 features of the policing system in Whitechapel. Try and do this question relatively quickly. You get 1 mark for a feature and 1 mark for some supporting evidence. And you need to be able to write about 2 clear features. The exam booklet will actually give you space to write in those 2 features. They give you a few lines. You don't necessarily have to fill all those lines. And make sure you do not spend too long on question 1. That's a common problem that sometimes people have. So you'll then go to question 2A. Now this question is about usefulness of historical sources. So you need to read the question carefully. In this case, it says how useful are sources A and B for an inquiry into violent crime in the Whitechapel area. And you need to imagine that, say if you were an historian and you were carrying out an inquiry into violent crime, how useful would these sources be? And there's 3 things you need to think about really carefully. Firstly, you need to write about how useful the content of the source is. How useful the provenance of the source is, so that means who wrote it, when it was written, and then how useful is it according to your own knowledge. So is it backed up by your own knowledge? So you need to use your contextual knowledge for this. So you'll get the sources like this, and the best way to think about it is that the content is like you can see here. I'm just pointing it to with my arrow. That the content is what the source actually tells you. So how useful is that information? The provenance is what I sometimes call the blurb, the bit at the top which tells you where the source comes from. How useful is that? And then the knowledge is what you already have in your brain from your hard work and revision that you've been doing for your exams. That's quite a nice way to think about it. Content, provenance, and then knowledge is what you bring to the party, if you like. So sometimes people find this question quite difficult, and remember, it's the same exam technique as the Germany question, Unit 3, question 3A. So let me just clarify a few key points for the usefulness question. If you get your exam technique right, you're going to do really well on this. You don't need any introductions, so you're basically going to write 2 paragraphs for this question. Your first paragraph will be about source A, your second paragraph will be about source B. Make sure that you don't just describe the source, so you should always start off by using a phrase like source A is useful because. And it's really good to start to quantify how useful it is. So you can see in yellow on the right hand side here, starting off from where it says a source is irrelevant, going right up to being extremely useful. These are some nice words to help you to quantify exactly how useful an historical source would be. You must link it to the inquiry that the historian is actually looking at. Sources aren't just generally useful or not useful. They're useful according to whether they give you good information for a particular inquiry. So that's really important advice for this question. Remember in class I've sometimes used the analogy about a banana and a hammer, and that if you were putting a picture on the wall, a hammer would be really useful, but a banana would be less useful. So you've got to think about it in terms of that. How useful is this source for that particular inquiry? It's probably one of the questions going to give you the most challenge in terms of exam technique, so you really need to practice your exam technique for question 2A. You've only got 12 minutes, so don't be tempted to write too much. Good luck on that question. Question 2B. This is what's called the follow-up question. So the question will say something like, how could you follow up source A to find out more about violent crime in the Whitechapel area? Now, In the exam paper, they'll actually give you specific spaces to write down what you need to say. But basically, there's 4 things you have to do to be successful in this question. First, you have to actually select the detail in the source that you want to follow up. So you're going to be looking at, in this case, let's say a source A. What is a quote? What's a detail from a source that you might want to follow up on? So you might pick a quote from the source. You then need to turn that into a question. So what question would you actually ask? So your answer in the exam booklet must be you actually writing down an historical question. What type of source would you use? And it must be a primary source, so you cannot just write down the internet or a school book, or I'm going to ask my history teacher. So it might be things like police records, court records, newspaper articles from the Penny Dreadfuls, for example, freedom licenses that they gave to prisoners when they were freed. Then you have to explain in your own words how the primary source might help answer that question. So that's the space in the exam booklet that they give you. So you only need, say, 2 or 3 lines for each part of the question. And it is only worth 4 marks, so you'd spend 6 minutes on that question. The key really for this question is to think, what is the detail in the source you would follow up? So for example, if you had a source that was telling you about a person who'd been attacked by a group of 5 people, you might follow up on the detail that a person had been attacked by 5 people, and that might give you a question: was gang activity common in Whitechapel in this area? You could then have a look at some of the newspaper articles at the time, some of the Penny Dreadfuls, and it might help answer your question, because you might think, how many articles are there that talk about gangs in Whitechapel, and that might help you to actually find out the answer to that question. So that's an example of some actual details that is taken from a past question, so you can have a little look at that, and you can pause that if you want to read that in your own time. So that concludes the information about Whitechapel on the exam. We then go to questions 3, 4 and then 5 or 6, which is about crime and punishment generally. The exam technique is a little bit more straightforward. Question 3 is a 4-mark question. They look for either similarities or differences, so this really tests your chronological understanding. In this case, it says explain one way in which punishments in Norman times were similar to those in Saxon times. And the key with this question is you must write about evidence from both time periods. That's absolutely crucial. So if you're going to talk about how punishments were similar, you need a specific bit of evidence from Norman times, but also from Saxon times as well. And then question 4 is the explain why question. We have this question on the Germany exam. This is question 2 on the Germany exam, and explain why question. So for this question, you are looking to write 3 paragraphs that identify 3 separate factors to explain the event. You want 1 paragraph for each factor. The question will give you 2 bullet points, but in order to get more than 8 out of 12, you have to be able to bring in some of your own knowledge as well. So the bullet points are incredibly useful. You can almost see them as like a mini plan and use them, but you need to focus on point, detailed evidence and explanation, and to get the higher marks, so to get up to say 9, 10, 11 or 12 out of 12, you need to start to evaluate how important the factors were as well. So you've got a real test here in terms of historical evidence, but also using that evidence to explain why something has happened. So that's what question 4 is. So it might be explain why the police were set up in 1829, explain why the Bow Street Runners were set up, or explain why capital punishment was abolished in the 20th century. So it really tests your knowledge of causation. So that's how you go about doing question 4. Okay, as an example question for you there. And then question 5 and question 6, you have to evaluate an opinion. So they will give you an opinion, such as the Norman conquest led to huge changes in the history of crime and punishment. How far do you agree? Explain your answer. Now, it's quite good practice to have an introduction if you've got time, but the most important thing to do is to find evidence which agrees with the opinion, and then you need a counter-argument which disagrees with the opinion, and then a conclusion where you give your judgment. And the key thing here, again, is to use detailed historical evidence to support your opinions, but you need to bring in that language of evaluation. There's some useful phrases there. In some ways I would agree, I partially agree, in conclusion, in the final analysis. These are all nice phrases. And remember, your SPAG marks are important here as well, so you'll be tested on your spelling, punctuation and grammar, so make sure you write accurately. There's an example question just for you to have a look at. And this extensometer, this is really, really useful throughout all the history questions, just to give you an idea on language to use in terms of how far you agree and disagree. So good luck with this, guys. That is the crime and punishment exam advice. Thank you for listening.